Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining me today for our second module of the Birch Project's 10 training modules on supporting youth in schools and in the community, trainings for paraprofessionals and mentors. This module is titled Understanding Behavior, the ABCs, and we will be talking about how we can better understand behavior to support the children that we work with. If you tuned into our first module, Module 1, Reviewing Public Health Approaches, you will have some foundational information that this module will build on. And if you have not yet had the opportunity to check that module out, we will review some here, but I encourage you to complete that module as well to make sure that you are set up for success with the overview of some key components that will be discussed in the rest of the modules. Before beginning with our content, I would like to introduce the Birch Project to those of you joining us for the first time for this module series. The Birch Project is the Behavioral Health Integrated Resources for Children project. Its mission is to provide professional development and resources for schools, as well as to strengthen coordination of behavioral health supports across school and community agencies. The Birch Project is led by faculty members from UMass Boston and UMass Amherst and is sponsored by Boston Children's Hospital. For more information, please check out our website at umb.edu/birch. So I am Amanda Priest, and I am a second year doctoral student in the counseling psychology program here at UMass Boston and one of the members of the Birch team. I also previously worked as a special education teacher in the Boston public school system. We would like to extend a really big thank you to all of the paraprofessionals and mentors who made these modules possible. They provided us with invaluable insights into the work that they do, which helped us develop the module that you are about to view. So, for our learning objectives, participants will be able to define and provide examples of the ABCs of behavior, describe methods for de-escalating challenging behavior, as well as prevention and intervention strategies, and demonstrate an understanding of trauma in a systemic context, as well as tools to support children who are trauma survivors. Here's an overview of the topics that we will be covering in this module. We will be discussing the ABCs of behavior, the function of behavior, how to utilize the escalation cycle to recognize dysregulation, prevention and intervention strategies, and culturally responsive and trauma-informed practices. As a review, in the last module, you learned about the importance of your role. Paraprofessionals and mentors have the ability to significantly impact a youth's overall health and well-being. You also learned about evidence-based public health approaches that schools and agencies throughout the state are trying to implement. Finally, you learned about the prevent, teach, reinforce model as a way to think about supporting youth's social, emotional, and behavioral needs as a way to help them feel better, learn more, build off their strengths, and hopefully make things a little less difficult for them and the adults who support them. So, section 1, overview of the ABCs. The ABCs of behavior is an acronym for antecedents, behaviors, and consequences. The antecedent is the event or stimulus that triggers, aka happens before, some type of response from the individual. For example, an antecedent could be a parent directing their son, Jeremy, to stop playing video games because his allotted time for the day is up. This would then lead to a behavior, which could either be positive or negative. Let's say that Jeremy responds with the following behavior. He screams, "No, 10 more minutes, just 10 more minutes." And when his parents do not comply, he throws a tantrum and starts throwing objects around the house. Whatever happens after the behavior occurs is the consequence. A consequence is any outcome that occurs after the behavior starts, including reactions from others. So, what are some possible consequences of this scenario? For example, Jeremy's parents could take away his video games. Or maybe Jeremy's parents are stressed out. They're trying to work and get dinner ready, and they just want his tantrum to end, so they let him keep playing. The ABCs can be applied to human behavior across the lifespan. Can you think of an example of an ABC in your own life? When you see a child engaging in a behavior, you should always wonder, what purpose is this behavior serving for the child? As challenging as some behaviors can be, remind yourself that behavior is learned, it is predictable, and it is a form of communication. What is the child trying to tell you? I now want to introduce a fictional case study to you all that we will continue to reference throughout this module. Jackson is a 10-year-old Asian American student that moved to your town about 6 months ago. Ever since he arrived, he has had a lot of difficulty making friends. And when he does make friends, it is challenging for him to maintain the relationship due to some of his behaviors. He does not complete homework assignments or try to do classwork during the day, even though his team has assessed his academic skills and he seems to have the academic skills he needs to do the work. Jackson struggles to stay in his seat and often bolts from the classroom to avoid undesired tasks. When he becomes upset, he tends to engage in yelling, headbanging, and picking on others, including the teacher. At times, he will hide underneath his desk for seemingly no reason. When he does this, he will not engage in any conversation and remain silent, sometimes for over an hour. Jackson shows a strong desire to form connections with others. He loves to help out with tasks around the classroom and be a teacher's assistant. His interests also include playing basketball, building things with Legos, drawing, doing some magic tricks, and of course, playing video games after school. What are your initial thoughts about Jackson? What steps do you think you could take to better understand the function of Jackson's behavior? By tracking behavior, you will begin to see patterns that emerge in the data. Think of it like piecing together a puzzle. Right now, you have the edges, but you're still missing all the pieces in the middle. In the next part of the module, we will learn to better understand how the antecedents, behaviors, consequences, and the child's response to those consequences serve as a function for that child. All behavior has a function or purpose. By continually observing and analyzing the ABCs, we start to uncover what purpose different behaviors are serving for a youth. Now, I want you to practice completing a log entry. Let's read the following scenario about a student named Addie. You are walking a classroom of students to gym class. When your back is turned, Addie runs up to the front of the line and cuts one of the students. A bunch of the students start shouting, "Addie, you cut! Not fair! You cut! I was before you!" You turn around and ask Addie if she cut the other students, but she claims she did not. Since you know Addie cut, you tell her to return to the back of the line and express your disappointment at her dishonesty. Addie starts crying and sulks to the back of the room. A few seconds later, she tears down several pieces of student artwork that were displayed on a wall in the hallway. Refer to this scenario to fill in the behavior log. So, let's think about this and feel free to pause if you want to do this on your own and then check your answers. So, the antecedent was the teacher turned their back to the students. The behavior is that Addie cuts the line. The consequence was the other students start yelling at Addie. In addition, the teacher makes Addie return to the back of the line, which leads to Addie's response of crying and destroying school property. As you can see in this example, the consequence or reaction can come from multiple people and it tends to have a snowball effect. In this case, Addie's peers delivered the initial consequence or reaction. This then led to the teacher responding, which turned into an additional behavior in response from Addie. Part two, the function of behavior. When we refer to the function of behavior, we are talking about what behavior is trying to communicate. Here are some common functions of behavior. This list is not exhaustive, but it is helpful to be aware of. So, behavior may be used as a way to escape or avoid an undesired task or a challenging situation. It might be a way for a child to receive attention and connection with others. It could be used to obtain a desired outcome or object. It could be used to communicate something, to feel in control or powerful, to satisfy one's sensory needs, or as a response to a perceived or actual threat, which we will talk more about. We are now going to talk about trauma and how trauma influences behavior. So, what is trauma? Trauma is any experience or experiences that are perceived as life threatening or overwhelm the child's capacity to cope and respond. It can be a singular event, such as a shark attack or a car accident. Trauma can also be complex, which means that the trauma is something ongoing. For example, continual abuse throughout childhood is an example of complex trauma, as well as growing up in a neighborhood where the child is consistently a witness to violence in the community. And I included this quote from Bessel van der Kolk, who is a prominent psychiatrist that studies trauma. And he states, "Trauma is not just an event that took place sometime in the past. It is also the imprint left by that experience on mind, brain, and body. The imprint has lasting consequences for how the human organism continues to survive in the present." Sorry, I switched around some of the words in that, but you can see it on the screen. This quote really emphasizes how trauma continues to impact the individual throughout their lifespan, especially when it is not addressed. We're going to talk about more about how trauma impacts brain development, which leads to changes in behavior. We have learned through conducting research that trauma has a negative impact on brain development. Here are a variety of ways in which this impact is seen in behavior. These are important for you to be aware of because it might help you develop more empathy and understanding for the youth that you work with. Some consequences of trauma on the brain's development are difficulty regulating emotions, becoming very easily frightened or agitated, more aggression or impulsive behaviors, difficulty with focusing or learning, regression in terms of development. So, this means a child who had already reached a developmental milestone might regress. So, this could look like a 12-year-old who begins wetting the bed frequently, having difficulty with making and or keeping friends, and complaints of frequent physical symptoms such as stomach aches or headaches. While this list of symptoms can be overwhelming, what we have also learned is that stable, consistent, positive interactions over and over again with a trusted adult can mitigate the effects of trauma. It can literally rewire the brain to be healthier and more adaptive. So, now that you have this trauma informed perspective, let's get back to the case of Jackson and learn a little bit more about him. Jackson is an only child and he lives at home with his mom, his grandma, and his grandpa. He was adopted at the age of 3, and following his adoption, he lived with his mom and her former husband until he was 7 years old. Jackson's adoptive father was physically abusive towards his mother, and he witnessed significant domestic violence during his early childhood. Now that you know more about how trauma influences behavior, is there anything here that makes you think differently about some of the functions of Jackson's behavior? We are now going to talk about the escalation cycle, which is helpful because it allows us to recognize when a youth is escalating so that we can incorporate intervention and prevention strategies. Okay, so here is a visual representation of the cycle. So at the beginning, the baseline is that the youth is calm. Then the trigger, also known as the antecedent, occurs. This can lead to agitation, which you might see in some of the behaviors that have become familiar to you while working with this child. If this agitation is not addressed, the behavior can accelerate. Once it reaches a certain point, we consider this the peak. So, this would be the behavior in which the child is totally dysregulated and you know it's going to be more challenging to get through to them. After this peak occurs, de escalation takes place. So, the child starts to calm down, which leads to post crisis depletion. They might seem really tired or just physically and emotionally toast. After reaching that peak and coming down from it, they are totally exhausted. Then recovery takes place, which is when the child is feeling better and some kind of resolution has been reached. So, we're now going to use what we just learned about the escalation cycle to help us decide ways that we can de escalate behavior given the situation in front of us. It can be really difficult to maintain composure and stay calm when you have a child in crisis or at that peak point in front of you. De escalation tends to be most successful if it can be applied before the youth gets to that peak. This means that it's very important to become aware of signs that an individual is becoming agitated or accelerating toward their limit. Signs tend to differ from person to person, which is why tracking behavior and utilizing those behavior logs is so useful. But I want to also share some common signs of agitation with you to be on the lookout for. So, someone who is agitated might be fidgeting a lot or playing with things that are in front of them. They may also clench their jaw or ball their fists, which are signs of tension. You may recognize some changes to their speech. In particular, you want to pay attention to the pitch of their voice, the tone that they are using, and the speed. So, someone agitated tends to start speaking more quickly, their pitch might become higher, and their tone might demonstrate to you their level of frustration. You may also notice them visibly shaking or glaring and eyeballing at other students or staff members around them. They may also tear apart or start picking at something. This would be nothing too serious in terms of destroying property, but it might be like ripping up a piece of paper or breaking a pencil. And you might also notice that they're pulling out their hair or picking at or pinching their skin, which are signs of anxiety. So, I'm going to teach you some de escalation strategies that you can utilize when you see those signs of agitation that we just talked about. The most important thing is to remain as calm as possible and neutral. Being neutral means that your body language, tone of voice, and facial expressions convey to the youth that you're here to help them and support them. So you want to stay outside of their personal space, give them plenty of room, and don't stand square with them. So try not to stand directly looking at them, stand off to the side or diagonally from them so that they don't feel boxed in. You can also provide them with choices, as this will give them the feeling of more control. So, for example, you might say, we can either wait 5 minutes until you feel more ready and then talk about what to do, or we can go for a walk and talk about what to do together. As difficult as it may be to try to ignore challenges to your authority or to the situation at hand, don't ignore the child altogether, but ignore any statements that they are making in order to try to challenge you. You want to focus your attention on problem solving collaboratively with that individual. You also want to make sure that you really focus on and validate their feelings. So you're not saying that their behavior is okay. You're just saying that what happened or what you or someone else said may must have made him feel really frustrated, or I understand why that would have really upset you. The last point is to allow the individual time to really think and reflect, which often means we might be sitting there in silence for a bit. Sometimes, as behavior support staff, when we are using a strategy like silence or remaining calm, we can feel judged by others around us who feel frustrated by this student's behavior and think that we should be doing something to reprimand them. Keep in mind that you are there to serve that youth, and perhaps you can educate other people around you about why you're using some of the strategies that you are. We also know that in the long term, the prevention, teach, and reinforce strategy And using these de-escalation strategies mentioned will support the youth in developing skills and in decreasing. We don't want to increase it. It'll help in decreasing challenging behaviors in the long run. We're now going to talk more about prevention and intervention strategies. So, here are some strategies that you can use to prevent the student from leaving that baseline level and moving up the escalation cycle. First, provide lots of warnings. Sometimes this might seem excessive to you, but a lot of youth really need this in order to feel in control and prepare for transitions. So you might say to them, okay, in 5 minutes, break time will be over, and we will need to put all of the coloring materials away. And then you might give another warning at 2 minutes, and then 1 minute, and so on. By giving several warnings, this helps the student to be prepared for what's coming and gives them time to process that they will need to make a change soon. Another strategy is to focus heavily on the positives, so use really specific language. Instead of saying, good job, say something like, wow, I love the way that you just put your materials away without me even asking. That was so great. So, as much as possible, you're really trying to highlight the things that this individual does well. Another strategy is to ignore undesirable behaviors. So, we now know one function of behavior is to connect with others. So, if the student is trying to get attention by engaging in a negative or undesired behavior, you simply want to try to ignore them for as long as possible. A way to do this in a classroom or group setting would be to really highlight positive behaviors that other youth are engaged in. This may push the student to also want to impress and connect with you by doing the same thing. A fourth prevention strategy is to offer choices and time for the youth to calm down. So if you see that they're agitated and accelerating towards that peak, you might say, hey, how about you go to the bathroom, splash some water on your face, and we can chat about what to do when you come back. This just gives them some more time to process and to feel like they have more agency over what's happening. An additional strategy is to provide the youth with opportunities to build their self confidence. So, if there is an activity that they really like or are passionate about, you want to really build on that and help them feel empowered. So, this might be saying, like, wow, you're so talented in art. Can you show me how to draw a fish? Or, wow, you're so great at building with Legos. That's something that's really hard for me. Do you think you could teach me more about how you do that? Showing interest in things that the youth cares about while also giving them an opportunity to build that confidence deepens your relationship with them and will help you connect better with them when they're in the times of crisis. And to go off of that, you want to do everything that you can to build positive relationships. So take time to really get to know them and learn about their likes, dislikes, any talents that they have, and so forth. As much as possible, we want to use a strengths based approach and really show the youth that we're there to support them and focus on the positive with them rather than being someone who always reprimands them for something they're doing wrong. And something else that I want to mention is to build in rehearsal opportunities as much as possible. So, for example, if you provide a warning, you might ask a youth to repeat that warning back to you. So, when you say, hey, just a reminder, in 5 minutes, we're going to clean up, go to lunch, and you would say, can you repeat that back to me, what I just said? This way, you are checking that they actually heard and processed what you said to them and that they're stating the directions themselves, which gets them even more prepared for that transition. Now I'm going to provide you with some additional intervention strategies. First things first, intervene as quickly as you can when you notice agitation. So this might look like practicing mindfulness or breathing strategies with the youth, or finding a space away from others where you can help them self self-soothe and manage their emotions. You also want to model pro social behaviors as much as possible, and you can do this by demonstrating the positive interactions with other adults. You can also role play with the students and practice some social situations with them they might run into. Additionally, if it is helpful for the youth you are working with, You can have them use the sensory tools that are not too distracting for them, like Fitbits or Velcro or a resistance band at the bottom of their chair that they can kind of bounce off of and get some anxious feelings out. It's also really important to debrief with the youth after a behavioral incident occurs. This is after the youth has calmed down and is regulated. So you want to talk to them and show them that you care about their point of view and you want to know what happened from their perspective. You want to also recognize what exactly triggered them and what they're feeling in that moment, because this will help you in the future to utilize prevention strategies and understand what works for that youth. Another intervention is just a reminder to always stay calm if you can, and remind students that you're there with them and you will work through the problem together. This way, they know that they're not alone and that you care about them and you want to help them. And then celebrate progress. So use that specific verbal praise that we talked about as often as you can and give feedback to the student when you see them working hard or making a change that you have practiced together. And also affirm them for their ability to move from dysregulation to regulation because this is not easy to do. So we want to make sure we're really recognizing when a youth is able to do that. So we are going to return to the case of Jackson and use what we have learned about interventions to help us in some different scenarios with him. First, Jackson walks into the classroom and looks visibly upset. It looks like he has been crying, and he immediately puts his head down when he sits at his desk. Given what you know about Jackson, what prevention strategies might you try? As you think about this or discuss this if you're in a group, I want you to consider what the goal of this interaction is. So, what would you see as a success? What do you want Jackson to do when all is said and done? And how would you measure that success? Would it be Jackson utilizing a coping strategy and then engaging in work after 5 minutes or something else? You can pause this presentation now to work through this first scenario. The second part of this scenario is that after you have helped Jackson calm down at the start of the school day, he ended up having a successful morning. During afternoon math class, the students are all taking a quiz. Math is an especially hard subject for Jackson. He tears up his quiz and starts yelling and distracting other students. So, given what you know about him, what intervention strategies are you going to try? And again, what is your goal and how are you going to measure success? For example, would success to you look like him working on the math test later in the day after he calms down? Or for him to try 5 items on the test once he uses a coping tool and then finish later on when he is in a better state of mind? Again, you can pause this presentation to work through this second piece of the scenario. We're now going to talk about culturally responsive practices. So, what does it mean to be culturally responsive? I have included this definition of cultural competence here, but we are not using that word competence in these modules because we feel the word responsive better represents what this looks like in practice. No one can ever be fully competent because we cannot possibly know everything about every culture and experience that others have had. Culturally responsive practices are something that we are always striving toward. So, if you look at the definition, it is the ability of individuals and systems to respond respectfully and effectively to people of all cultures, classes, races, ethnic backgrounds, sexual orientations, and faiths or religions in a manner that recognizes, affirms, and values the worth of individuals, families, tribes, and communities, and protects and preserves the dignity of each. Let's talk more about what this looks like in your work with youth. Let's take Jackson as an example. Based on what you have learned about him, what aspects of his identity are important for you to consider in your work with him? So, again, as I ask these questions, feel free to pause and discuss if you're in a group or to reflect on your own. Um, for this first question, some important factors to consider would be his adoption, moving from one community to another, the culture of his home family versus the family he was born into. So, those are a couple that you might have thought of on your own, or you might have also thought of some additional ones. Now, I want you to think about your own cultural values and expectations. Are there values you hold that might interfere with your work with Jackson? For example, I want you to think about how the way that we grew up and were disciplined can impact how we think children should be held accountable for mistakes. Are we approaching our work with the mindset that adults are always right, that they don't need to apologize? What about your culture and values might positively support your work with Jackson? And finally, I want you to brainstorm some ways in which you could learn more about the cultural values of the families and children that you work with. And again, pause, reflect, write things down if that works for you. Just really take your time thinking through these because these are some big questions. We have made it to the end of this module, and just to review, here are the three biggest takeaways that I want you to leave this module with. First, remember that behavior is learned, it is predictable, and it communicates a need. So we can always look at behavior and consider what is its function so we can choose a more effective intervention. Second, behaviors can be impacted by prevention and intervention strategies, and we can use that escalation cycle to help us know when and which ones to use. And third, trauma focused and culturally responsive practices inform our understanding of behavior and development. So we should always, always, always be considering these things in the work that we do with youth. Here are some additional research and resources for you to learn more about these topics, in particular about the impact that trauma has on behavior and how to create an environment for kids that is trauma informed. So, these are some suggested activities people that are attending this training can do and practice themselves following this session. Or if they're in a group, they can have these activities to practice the skills with each other that were introduced during the session. Thank you so much for attending the second module. Please complete the evaluation form by visiting the link on this slide. We would love to hear your feedback. At our website, www.umb.edu/birch, you can sign up for our subscription list to get more information on best practices related to supporting the behavioral health needs and well-being of youth. We would love to hear from you. Please reach out to us with any thoughts or questions. Thank you for all that you do to support youth in our schools and communities. It is difficult work, and we are so grateful for you.